And for this video, we have the combination of fine Italian hand craftsmanship replicating the finest in German engineering. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, or I should say buongiorno for this model showcase video, because what we have here is my 1/72nd scale Italian Army Leopard 1 A2 tank. The model in this video here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6th scale. This model here being 172 is outside of my normal working purview. However, if anyone is interested in the scales that I do offer commission build services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. The model in this video is built mostly out of the box. However, I went ahead and deviated from the kit, enhancing it a little bit further compared to what the base starter kit gives you. In this video, we're going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review, and we're also going to be going over several of the extra details and add-ons that were made to the model to bring it up to the condition that we have here. So either way, we have a lot of cool info coming at you, so just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Leopard 1 A2 main battle tank. Of course, the Leopard is a very important and iconic Cold War era tank, and was one that was extremely noteworthy. The vehicle was, of course, designed in West Germany in the post-war years in the 1960s time frame, specifically as soon as the embargo for West Germany to go ahead and develop arms and military equipment was once lifted. Prior to the Leopard, the vehicles that were being used and fielded by the Bundeswehr were all foreign in nature, and specifically they were from the United States. The Bundeswehr were using the M47 patent, as well as also the M48 patent, up until the time of the 60s when finally they were able to produce their own vehicles. Although the Bundeswehr were utilizing both of those vehicles quite extensively, they did see room for improvement, and they saw several needs where the American vehicles fell short that would have better suited the German military. The German military took a look at the American vehicles, and they saw the things that they liked, as well as areas where they could improve and better make it suited again for the German military. Once they had these requirements, they went ahead and consulted with Porsche to go ahead and come up with this brand new tank design that was going to be a 100% German designed as well as produced vehicle. Porsche went ahead and dusted off their tank designing skills to go ahead and set forth to design this new vehicle. Unlike the previous generation of Porsche designed tanks, this one here was going to be more grounded and wasn't going to be as problematic or as out of the box and half-baked compared to the earlier designs that they came up with in the decades that preceded it. The vehicle is going to incorporate all of the modern manufacturing technology of the period to produce these vehicles, as well as also utilizing many of the standard design layout type features that are found on the other vehicles of the period. For the inspiration, again, the Leopard was going to heavily utilize a lot of inspiration from the M48 and also the M47. This is why if we look at the Leopard, it has more similarities to those vehicles as opposed to the World War II big cats. This is why the Leopard utilizes an all-cast steel turret, along with a mosaic type hull that is manufactured utilizing both cast and rolled steel components. The vehicle suspension is also heavily influenced again from the M47 and the M48, along with their track. The vehicle also features a rear-mounted engine and power pack, which has the transmission as a one single unit, which again was basically standard at this time for many tanks of the period. Even the turret had the commander's cupola located on the American side as opposed to the World War II vehicles that had it on the opposite side of the turret. However, that's really where the inspiration from the American tanks end, and this is where the Leopard starts coming into its own. The Leopard was going to be more of a standard general purpose tank. So as opposed to being a heavy tank or a medium tank or a light tank, they went with what the cool kids on the block were doing at the time and developing what's known as a main battle tank, where it's one tank that basically does everything and it's equally balanced in terms of firepower, protection, and mobility. The vehicle's armor protection wasn't going to be as thick compared to some of the other contemporaries being developed by the West. However, it was going to be sufficient enough for the job at hand. Because of this, the vehicle was extremely fast and nimble, being powered by a Mercedes-Benz V12 diesel engine. For armament, the vehicle was going to use the NATO standard British Royal Ordnance L7-105, which was again being fielded by basically every one of the other NATO countries of the period. The vehicle's secondary armament would have been utilizing two MG3 MGs, which is the 308 or the 7.62 NATO chambered variant of the infamous German MG42. The vehicle, of course, was ready for fielding in 1965, where it became the standard Panzer of the Bundeswehr. However, during the vehicle's development, all the other NATO countries saw what the Germans were doing and said, that's a pretty cool idea, let's get in on it. And during the development, you had Italy, the Netherlands, as well as also France involved with the tank design and keeping up on the tank's progress. Eventually, the French lost interest and went ahead and did their own thing because French, and they went ahead and took a lot of the design elements that went into the Leopard and put it on their own domestic tank, which became the AMX-30. However, the other NATO countries basically all adopted the Leopard, and the Leopard essentially became the standard tank of NATO. What the T-55 was to the Warsaw Pact, the Leopard 1 was to NATO. And that's where we have this model here, where it's representing a Leopard 1A2 from the Italian Army. The Italian Army utilized the Leopard 1 to great effect for many decades, until eventually retiring them with a more modern tank design. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started, in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1980s vintage ESCI 1/72nd scale Leopard 1A2. Obviously, what we have here is another vintage kit build, and the ESCI Leopard 1A2 kits are a vintage kit that dates back to the late 1980s. I want to say 1987 to 1988, around thereabouts. Just like with the other kits from the same line, ESCI, of course, is a Italian model company that has its roots back in the 1970s or so, and they produce a wide range of subjects, from airplanes to military vehicles, and obviously for the purposes of this channel, we focus on the tank aspect of it. ESCI produced a military vehicle range in 1/72nd scale, as well as also a limited range of vehicles in 135, and their kits were very highly regarded at the time. During this period here, the ESCI kits were essentially the super kits of the era, and this is seen on the craftsmanship that's generally seen on their molds and tooling. Obviously, if you're a fan of the channel, you know that this is far from the first time I've done an ESCI build, nor is it a first time that I've done an ESCI build in 1/72nd scale. Lately, I've been kind of snatching up all the old ESCIs, and I've been essentially just filling out the collection and completing the lineup. But either way, the Leopard 1A2 kit that we see here is a very recent addition to the stash. It came in about a week or so ago, and this model particularly I picked up off of eBay. These kits here are still fairly common and are still fairly available, which means tracking one down for a relatively modest price is still something that can be done. This model here obviously is still mint in box. It originally had the shrink wrap on it, however, didn't really make it to the table, and the shrink wrap just kind of gave up the ghost. But either way, this kit here is still mint in the box. Price-wise, with shipping and everything, I paid under $20 for it, so again, these kits are still fairly common. As for the kit itself, or I should say the company itself, like I mentioned before, ESCI was a big-time company back in the 80s time frame. However, by the mid-1990s, they actually ended up going bankrupt, and a large number of their kits were sold off to Italein. In the past, Italein have re-released many of the ESCI kits that they have the tooling for, and this was seen with things like the Merkava, the M4A1 Sherman, as well as also their M60 kits, to name a few. However, I'm not sure if the Leopard kit here is one of those that made the switch over from ESCI to Italein, so if that's not the case and Italein does not have the tooling for this one over here, these kits here are essentially just what's out there is out there. Now, ESCI did produce a decent number of these kits throughout the years that they were in production, or in business, I should say. So tracking one down is fairly easily done even in this day and age. However, it's one of those things where if you're interested in one, you might want to jump on one sooner than later, because these are the type of things that once the availability starts drying up, they cross over into the threshold of collectability, and then the prices do tend to go up. Post-production John here with a quick little addendum. As it turns out, this particular kit was acquired by Italain, and they have re-released it on a couple occasions in the past. Although at the time of filming this, it's been a number of years, but the kit has been re-released by them, and oddly enough, during the re-release, they recycled the box art from their 1/35th scale counterpart. I guess if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Another thing that's interesting about the ESCI kits is that even though the kits themselves are pushing 35 plus, in most cases 40 plus years of age, the tooling on the kits have actually aged remarkably well in most cases. They do have some interesting quirks to them that we'll see once I crack the box open and look at the parts. However, the quality on the tooling on these parts here are so good that really they kind of age very well, and in many cases the kits are still as relevant today as they were when they were first released back in the 80s. Another thing to mention is that ESCI produced a wide range of tank kits from both World War II as well as from the modern era, or at least modern at the time. The Leopard that we have here was released in two formats. This here is the version that's just your standard plain Jane Leopard 1, but they also released another version of the Leopard 1 with the applicate side armor found on the turret, but that's another kit for another day. The other thing to mention is that back when the kits were first released, i.e. the World War II line, that seems like was released in the late 70s, early 80s timeframe. And then when the 80s kicked off, they decided to design a bunch of new kits of the modern era. And again, some other kits of noteworthy would be the Merkava, their M68-1, the M68-3, they did a Starship, as well as also a T-62, to name a few. These kits are pretty cool. They're pretty collectible, and again, it's kind of fun, or I found it pretty fun and enjoyable to start with snatching the ones out there and fleshing out the collection. But anyway, let's go ahead and crack this one open. But to do that, let's first go ahead and review the box. So starting with the box art and graphic design, this one here is what we generally see on the first generation of these kit releases, where the box is just this white background, much along the lines as we see on Tamiya kits, as well as also Italain kits of the era, and we have a nice illustration here of the vehicle in question. Of course, it's being a Leopard 1A2, and the box art is actually pretty decent. It's obviously a good representation of the vehicle in question. As for the remainder of the graphic design, it's in the standard ESCI format of this period, where we have the ESCI logo up there in the upper right-hand corner. The Leopard 1A2 name over here in the sans serif typeface with that little drop shadow to it, as well as also that nice little red bar running across the top. Obviously, it's 1/72nd scale, and this was brand new of the period, as we can see here with this nice little track diagram. This kit also has decals for several other vehicles, as the Leopard 1 was widely issued out to NATO countries, so we have decals here for various other countries, namely Italy and Belgium, to name a few. The rest of the graphic design is in this attractive red coloring. On the side tab over here, we have a thumbnail image of the vehicle in question. By the way, this is kit number 8301 for those who are interested. And you can see again the ESCI logo. Side portion here, we have some corporate information. Same is also true for the opposite side here, and it's just in various languages. Obviously, these kits were sold all throughout the world, and they had some very good distribution. Oh, another thing to mention is that later on, for US distribution, the ESCI kits were distributed in the United States by Ertl, so we do have several other options of box arts out there, where we have the ESCI logo with the Ertl logo below it, and then we also have several other versions with a different type of box art with the AMT logo also found in the corner. Obviously, it's the exact same tooling, it's just a different box art due to the different distributor that was importing them specifically in the United States. On the reverse side here, we just have the exact same graphic design found on the reverse, but obviously with this guy here on the reverse section. The other thing that's interesting about the ESCI kits is that they are a side opening tab type box. This is generally not something that we see on tank kits, specifically in the current era. So it is interesting to point out. The kit just slides out, and these are all the components here. This here is a vintage model kit through and through, so just right out the bat, you're not going to have modern amenities such as photo etch or turned aluminum or 3D print or anything along those lines. It's all old school injection molded polystyrene. All the parts are hermetically sealed in this bag over here, so that's in this bag what 1988 probably smells like. So we'll see what that's like in a moment. No, I'm not going to huff it, but it's still kind of funny to mention. And no, do not huff things. I'm just going to go on record and say that huffing things is a bad idea. Anyway, so the first thing we have here is a set of Worst Light decals. Like I said before, you have several options available for the vehicle, from Italy to Norway to Belgium. And I'm pretty sure there's one for the Bundeswehr, or at least there should be in here. We'll see what that looks like momentarily. They don't have one for the Bundeswehr. That would be actually quite sad, because it's kind of the way I want to build the vehicle, but we'll see how that goes. Anyway, the decals are pretty good for what they are. In the past, I've had mixed results with the ESCI markings. They have been hit or miss. Some decals came out to be okay. Others just didn't age very well, and they just snapped into oblivion when they made contact with the water. These decals over here seem to be in remarkable good shape, considering the age. More likely have to do with the way the vehicle was hermetically sealed for all those years, so this is probably the first time it's being exposed to 2025 air. So, but it's going to be interesting to see how they turn out. But so far, these decals do look pretty good. So far from my experience, I think they'll be okay. Over here we have a nice little instruction sheet here of 2 Leopard 1s doing some kind of maneuvers. And these instructions here are as old school can get. So they are all hand-drafted type drawings. No more, and most certainly no less. That's it for the instructions. This takes us to the kit's tooling itself. So again, everything is hermetically sealed from 1988. And just like whenever you build any of these old models, you do have a Highlander type approach where
there can be only one.
Fear not though, hopefully this build will not be in vain and will be one that we all can enjoy and share together. And it'll also be a nice addition to my collection. Either way, it's a win. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully open this packaging here. Oh yeah, that's 1988. Okay, takes me back to when I was a kid. Alright, anyway, let's go ahead and look at the tooling. So, all of the kit's parts are molded in this dark olive green plastic. The plastic itself actually kind of looks like the same type of plastic that we saw on many of the older Italain kits from the same era. There is this rumor out there that Italain is actually the one that did the molding for ESCI, which isn't something that is too surprising or it's not too implausible, because again, Italain more than likely did the molding for these pieces here and possibly the casting, as again, many of the ESCI kits that survive today are produced by Italain, but that is mere speculation. However, it's beginning to walk like a duck and quack like a duck, so anyway, take that for what you will. We'll get to this runner momentarily, and you probably know why if you're a fan of my channel. Alright, so we're going to start actually with this runner here. Okay, so we do have some parts that are running around loose. I want to be careful not to lose those. All right, so the first runner here is the turret components. And I gotta say, the parts are so far excellently rendered out. You can see the molding here on the turret itself. It definitely has what appears to be the proper shape for the Leopard 1. It's got the periscopes right there integrally molded on. This hatch here is molded in the shut position. There is a slight sink mark on that area over here. However, with the way these German hatches are, there's this standoff section that kind of covers up this section. So that is something more likely is not going to be visible. One error I do see on the turret hatch, and the only reason why I know this is an error because the Revell Germany Leopard 1 in 1/72nd scale and larger did address this, is that there is a dimple found in this section here of the underside of the turret, and that is for the clearance of the driver's hatch when the turret is rotated around. Obviously, it's missing on the ESCI counterpart. We have here the front trunnion so that the barrel can go up and down. That is actually an improvement over the Revell kit where it's just solid. We do have a nice finely molded gypsy rack specifically for, again, 1980s tooling. It's actually molded pretty nicely. Some parts I do see some sink marks in them, so that is something that would be considered a ding by most contemporary builders out there, but when you're working with a vintage kit, it's kind of normal. We do have some, again, finely molded bottom sections here for the gypsy rack. And we have the rangefinder detailing, again, nicely molded for the era. The tarpaulin is integrally molded on and is also, again, nicely sculpted. Got the ridges in and everything. Definitely looks the part once fitted and painted in place. We do have some flash on these two canisters over here. Quite normal, again, for older tooling kits, but we'll see how that cleans up. So setting this runner aside takes us to the next runner here, which contains a large number of the hull components, namely the entire lower pan over here. It does appear to be missing some of the axis panels, which would be found on the bottom portion of the hull. This one here is just nice and smooth. We do have a slight little sink mark right over there. A little drop of putty. You should definitely do short work of that. On this section, we do have the exhaust manifold sections that are separately molded, which is nice. The piece is replicating the horizontal slat version of the Leopard 1, as opposed to the other option, which would be the oval type grille layout, which is also, again, seen on several other vehicles of this type. But on the ESCI one here, you only have the one option. We have some mud flap details right here. We have very intricately molded tow hooks, headlights, lift points. Smoke grenade launchers are each and separately molded, which is very nice. The sprockets are also decently rendered. They are toot sprockets through and through, which is a nice touch. Slight sink mark, but nothing too egregious, I would say. It appears that we have two options of tin work here, where we have the later style mud flap and the early style mud flap, which is interesting because the Revell Germany Leopard did the exact same thing. And we also have the 105, which is very nicely molded. It's a single piece, which is nice on a 172. Also, with the way these German barrels are, there's a lot of thermal straps on them, and if it's a two-part assembly, it tends to be a pain to go ahead and make sure that's deburred. So if it's one piece like this, it simplifies the job immensely. We also have here the rear plate and a large number of the details. It's late when I'm filming this. The details are integrally molded on, which would include the mud flaps, the taillights, that box. I have no idea what that box is for. It's probably a cable if I was to take a guess, but any Bundeswehr guy out there would know. Feel free to put that in the comment section below. We have another storage box over here, and we have some spare track, and of course the little the cruciform light. Very German. And all that's integrally molded on, and it looks great. Nice, crisp moldings. 1988, it looks fantastic for the era, and honestly, it still looks even great for today. The wheels are pretty decent. They have decent face detailing on them. However, one thing about the ESCI kits, specifically from this era, that makes them interesting is that the wheels are just solid. You'll look here, and it's just a solid wheel. So, of course, on the Leopard, it's just like on the M60 or on just about any other contemporary tank where the wheels are in two halves because there needs to be a center guide horn running in the center, and that's found on the track. On the ESCI kits here, they just molded the wheels one solid piece, and the tracks do not have their guide horns on them, and you'll see that when I get to the next sprue. Overall, this is something that's seen on all the other ESCI kits, and this is something I've had no problem with. It's 1/77 scale, so it seems to work okay, but this is something that some modern contemporary builders would definitely look askance towards. Here we also have the top hatches, and you can see they have that nice little star embossed pattern found on them. They look great. And again, as do most of the other parts, it looks like it's again, a high quality piece. Some of the parts that fell off really quick, we have the other sprocket right over here. The sink mark is still found on the center portion, but it's not as deep. Something I may or may not address. We'll see how that goes. We have here another portion here of the gypsy rack storage box, which cuts the gypsy rack in half. Anyone knows anything about these Leos, you'll know what I'm referring to. And we also have the mantlet right over here. Mantlet appears to be nicely shaped and rendered out. Hopefully it comes in camera and focus. There's a small little sinkhole over there. Again, welcome to the 80s. Okay, so that takes care of that sprue, and this brings us to the last runner. So the last runner has the upper hull, and note the upper hull detailing is excellent. We have here the grillwork found on the back portion. It's nicely finely molded, as well as the grillwork found on these two areas over here found on the engine deck. We have the filler spouts and some of the hinge work. What is admittedly missing are some of the fastener details, which would be on this panel over here, which are recessed into the plate, and obviously you would remove those to remove the engine hatch rear deck to get to service the engine. The other details, though, still look fantastic. The splash rim is excellently rendered out. The driver's hatch looks good. The periscopes look good. It has these areas over here, which would be non-slip sections found on the real vehicle, but they are molded in. Granted, there's no texturing on them, but they're still there, so that's still a leg up. The side hull detail has all of the tools integrally molded on, which is something that we still see today on lots of smaller scale builds, and they are cleanly molded, so painting them shouldn't be too hard to do. Again, that's more or less technique than anything else, but I'll circle back to that as the video goes on. Again, everything is crisply molded, so that looks fantastic. The one thing that is absent on this kit are underhull sponson. This is a thing that is seen on several other of the ESCI kits. The Merkava was like this as well, and this one is no exception. On this side here, you can see the suspension. All of the suspension torsion bars and shock absorbers are integrally molded onto the piece over here, which does simplify construction quite a bit. Even though they are integrally molded on, they do have some nice definition to them, and they are standing off from the lower hull panel very nicely and prominently, which again is indicative of good quality. We also have here an option for side skirts, and these are the traditional German Bundeswehr pattern side skirts with that cool zigzag on them. And again, everything is nicely rendered out. I'm on the fence if I'll use them or not. I kind of want to roll with its side skirt list, so more than likely, it means I'll probably have to get another one of these kits so I could have an example of each. Yay me. But that's a topic for another day. And this now takes us to the biggest, my opinion, hurdle and ding found on the ESCI kits, specifically their modern vehicle kit line, and that's with the tracks. So ESCI is actually the one that gave us the cursed individual link and link track. Or actually, I should rephrase that. If you're working on a modern tank kit and you see the tracks and they're link and length and you're struggling with them because they are complete garbage, or you're just coping massively hard, oh, they're not bad. Yeah, they're crap. Yeah, I hate to tell you, bro, but your tracks suck. Yeah, and you're wondering, but if you have a brainstem, you're saying to yourself, where the hell did these stupid things come from? Well, you could blame ESCI. ESCI is the ones that gave us these wonderful things, and they've been a cancerous pair of herpes on the tank market literally ever since. And they were always done again to save money. They don't look realistic. They never did. They never will. It was just done to save money because look how much they could just consolidate everything on one runner, one material, and they don't have to have extra materials for rubber tracks. The World War II tank line actually had rubber tracks, but then they decided to penny pinch in the 80s and go with these, and that's probably how they went bankrupt. Anyway, let's take a look at these tracks. So the tracks on the external portion look good for what they are. We have the German pattern of Leopard track with the rubber pads. The rubber pads are nicely defined. They have the end connectors integrally molded on. They are in a link and length setup, and this is again probably going to be the hardest part of the build to undertake, as they are on all tanks, but I do have a solution to assemble these things and actually have some good result, or as best results as you can with this pattern track, but we'll see what that looks like as the video goes on. Back to the quality over here. Decently rendered, and one thing about them, you don't have any spares, so you take your time and hopefully you don't have one go off the lost part of you, otherwise you're going to be screwed.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
On the interior portion of the tracks is where things get a little soft, and again, this is why it easily debunks the whole individual link and link tracks look more realistic argument, because they don't have guide horns on them, so no, they don't look realistic. Just throwing that out there. Are they good enough for the job on this build? I'd say yes, but I could say the same thing about single piece vinyl. But anyway, you can see that they look okay. They have the internal detailing on the inner end connector sections, they have these like little divots found in them. That is nice that they molded that on. The rubber pad itself is a little wonky on these Leopards. It's like a little thin little sliver of rubber sandwiched in between two metal sections, and that's not present on these tracks. And obviously, without the guide horns in this section, the tracks just look kind of weird. But it should do the job just fine, specifically once everything's assembled, painted, and weathered. But we'll see what that looks like again as the video goes on. And that's all there is for the plastic sprue. So, without further ado, let's hop to the shop when this thing is actually being built. Jumping forward a little bit takes us to the model. At this point here, the last of the pre-paint bits have been installed, modified, and at this point the model's actually ready to slide off of the paint. But before I do, I wanted to mention and show some aspects of the model at this point here because, well, after it's fully built and painted, you're not really going to get a chance to see it or appreciate it as much as you can right now. So the very first thing I'm going to go over is the suspension. Take the turret off for the time being. So you can see that the Lincoln Link track has been assembled along with the remainder of the suspension. However, as I often mention in these videos, what you see here is very deceiving because at this time the tracks and the suspension is not secured onto the model permanently. They are just held on in a single cartridge type unit, or as I like to refer to as a pontoon. This is a common feature that you will see on these ESCI builds or any of these 172s that I tackle with a similar type suspension for the same reasons. When it comes to building a model with individual Lincoln Link tracks, if you're absolutely stuck and you have no choice but to go with them, the pontoon format here is the best way to go about it. This allows you to have complete access to all of the areas here on the track itself, both the inner and the outer, as well as also onto the hull itself. And this is very relevant because when it comes time for painting and weathering, trying to paint and weather something as intricate as tracks, and on a vehicle like this, the tracks are a composite type thing where we have metal and rubber, and then we also have a similar type situation with the road wheels and the idlers. Trying to go ahead and thoroughly paint and weather everything when it's secured in place is extremely difficult, if not, dare I say, impossible. Which is why it often baffles me when I see people on YouTube and on the internet do these builds similar to this, and they have everything pre-assembled on the model and try to paint and work their way around it. I can tell you right now, it might look good on camera, but the second you see these things in a certain angle, you're going to have bare plastic exposed, and that's just not helping anybody. So, to prevent that type of situation from happening, do yourself a favor and roll with the pontoon type format. With this, you can literally get access to every area on the track as much as humanly possible in order to get the paint where it needs to go, and not only will it be exactly where you want it, less of a chance of there being any overspray type touching up, and furthermore, it just makes the job so much easier in having full access to the thing as opposed to not. The tracks themselves went together as good as you're going to get with a individual Lincoln Link setup, and what you see here, this one here is totally stock, and it went together again well, I guess. The hardest part on individual Lincoln Link tracks is timing around the sprocket, and also on the point where the track shifts from the road wheel and it has to kink upward to either match with or mate with the sprocket teeth, or in the front portion here of the roller. Then you also have to match the track around the round section of wheel and sprocket, and this is easier said than done, and this is actually the part that kneecaps most indie Link builds. And if you look carefully on these pictures or in videos on the internet and you see builds that have individual Lincoln Link tracks, you'll be able to quickly tell that the builds have individual Lincoln Link tracks. It's the part that absolutely sucks on them and why I hate them and love pissing on them as much as I can. So, but back to this one over here. So this one went together, again, as good as you're going to get with this type of setup, and for the most part, I guess it's alright. However, for this one here, I had a snafu happen with one of the links. It's not the fault with the kit, this is purely a human error, and while I was removing the track off of the sprue and had it clamped in my plier, when I was about to ply it in place, it went fing off the Las Partia, never to be seen from again. Son of a... So after a quick little moment of rage, I had to go ahead and find a solution. Fortunately, I had the wherewithal and the advantageous happenings of having a mold on hand for a 1/72nd scale Leopard track, and although that may sound a bit specific, that's exactly what happened. You see, a number of builds earlier, I actually did a Revell Germany Leopard 1A kit, or Leopard 1A5 build in 172, and if we recall on that build, because of yet another Revell Germany 172 had an incident where there weren't enough track links on hand to complete the job, I said, you know what, let me hedge my bets and go ahead and make a duplicate of the Leopard track in case I may have a situation similar. As it turns out, I didn't on that build, but I had a problem with the wheels that I'll swing, which is going to be relevant for this one in a moment, and because of that I had to destroy a few links, but luckily I was able to replace them with the cast resin ones that we have here. Well, after that build, I didn't need the mold anymore. I put it safely in my mold storage area. Well, as it turns out, it didn't sit for long because I needed services again for the ESCI. And at first I was kind of worried that because the other one's Revell Germany, this one's ESCI, there might be a continuity issue, because even though they're both the same scale and they're both the same type of track, a lot of times the kit designs are a little bit different from one another. And although that's a bit true for the Revell, at that point I really had nothing to lose, so I said screw it. I casted up a spare link and I threw it in place. And as it turns out, it proved to be absolutely perfectly matched with the ESCI. What's unique about the Revell is that the Revell kit has excellent external detailing, but unlike the ESCI, it also has the internal detailing well. So this includes the skeletal structure between the rubber pads and also the guide horn. Well, on the ESCI, that's not going to be necessary, so I was able to amputate the guide horn, and then the piece was dropped directly in place. With the location that it's in being over here on the wheel, you're not going to see the differences between the two tooling, so the only thing that's really relevant here is the face detailing, and as it turns out, the face is almost identical to the ESCI. In addition to the detailing being basically identical, so is the size. The piece is a drop-in install, once the tooth is removed, of course, which is actually quite stunning and unexpected, I might add. So it was a very, 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 very happy of all accidents that turned out to be the case. Otherwise, I would have been screwed, and I would probably have to have popped off another link and make a mold and do all that nonsense. But fortunately, I didn't have to do that because I already had to do that nonsense earlier for another build. So again, you never know when these molds will come in handy. Once everything is painted and weathered, this bad boy is going to blend in absolutely perfectly. But if it wasn't for this stupid link over here, yeah, the stock link would have went out without any issues. Back to the road wheels. So, like I mentioned on the other Revell Leopard kit, the Leopard has this potential of throwing you a curveball with the wheels. And it has to do with the front return, or I should say the front idler wheel and the main road wheels. The two wheels look almost identical. They are the exact same size, and to make matters worse, the pegs found on the model's hull are the exact same size. However, the wheels are different. Where are they different? It's with the as they say, the devil's in the details. So if this thing gets into focus, you'll see that the big difference is the hub detailing. The main road wheel has less lug nuts securing it to the base compared to the idler. The idler has much more little fasteners on there, as you can see around the center hub. And this is one of those things that you can easily screw up. Even though, to be fair, the kit does have all the components properly labeled, but if you're going through the motion, you just snip off all the road wheels and you have a nice little jumble of wheels that are clean and ready for install, this is where you could potentially run into issues. That's exactly what happened to me when I did the Revell Germany Leopard 185. This one here, I was smarter enough not to make that mistake, but yet I still had the track fling off the lost part of you. So you can't win them all. Anyway, that is something that you want to pay attention to when you're working on a Leopard kit. Now, on something like a larger scale model or something with single piece vinyl tracks, the issue is not as bad because you can notice it like, oh, okay, just pop it off and switch it. However, on something with indie links like this here where the tracks are glued in place, rock solid, that's when you're going to run into issues, as I mentioned in the other video. So bear that in mind. Do not be that guy. Do not do the mistake I made and use the appropriate wheels for the right location. You do that and the build will definitely come out better. So that's all there is for the suspension. This brings us to the hull. So the hull itself is a multi-piece assembly and goes together pretty well, or as well as it can for tooling of this age. And for the most part, it goes together pretty decently. You can see there is a small little seam found in the front section over here where the front glacis plate makes contact with the lower. And also the back section over here also needed just a little bit of just fine-tuning or hand polishing just to blend in all of the sections. Something like this is quite customarily seen on these older tooling kits, and it's just par for the course. On the front here, just a little swipe of red putty was utilized to fill in the gap. some wet sanding later, and everything was polished away. Also on the front here, there was a little sinkhole. This was plugged up with a little bit of red putty, and also a little bit of thick super glue, and hand polished again with wet sanding for good measure, making for a nice, smooth as silk appearance. Back section over here, putty wasn't necessary, just some wet sanding with some thick super glue was all that was required. And this, if you may have noticed, takes us to, well, there was another sink mark over here that was also taken care of with the same effects. Okay, with that out of the way, this now takes us to the sponsons. So originally, this kit does not have sponsons on it. It's sponsonless like many other kits of the period. And for this one over here, you'll notice I actually have to fabricate them. Why you may ask? Well, quite simply put, on the other builds, like say the Merkavas that have the similar type thing, I didn't need the sponsons because they have the side skirts in place. Even though technically that's slacking, I really should have added the side skirts for those, but with the side skirts in place, you don't see that section, so it's not a big deal. However, because this model here is being built with the side skirts not present, now the sponsons are going to become relevant. So rather than leaving the big gaping hole in the bottom that just would have, in my opinion, hurt the build, I went ahead and had to fabricate these sections here. And these were fabricated out of lengths of sheet styrene that were carefully cut to shape and fitted to the appropriate locations. Once the pieces were fitted in place, you can see a little swipe of red putty was added to these areas over here in order to polish and blend everything in so it's nice and smooth and seamless. And once everything is painted, it's going to look continuous as it would if the piece had the sponsons in place originally. Of course, we'll see as the build goes on what it looks like in its pre-painted format, but anyway, you get the drift. Also, you'll see that the return rollers have not been added yet. This gets done at the tail end of the build, just after the suspension sections are actually fitted in place. The other thing to mention is the top area over here with the grills. We have, on my example over here, I had a snafu where a little piece chipped away during sprue removal. These pieces are very finely molded, and with the way the plastic is, it can easily break. So on this one over here, a little chip was hogged out of the section over here, just again from trying to remove it off the sprue. Instead of trying to re-glue that little piece back on, I simply mounted the vent to the model itself, and then I carefully add a little swipe of putty in this area and polish it down to the way we have it here. Once it's fully painted, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. Rest of the details are all stock, as you can see. The only other modification that I made was to add extra detailing here to the engine deck. So on the engine deck, as I mentioned earlier in the unboxing portion, is completely, well, not completely missing detail, because it does have the nice grille details that we have here. However, what is absent are the fastener details, which would be found on the Leopard 1 rear deck. And of course, these fasteners used to keep everything bolted to the hull, so obviously they're fairly important. As for why they're missing, your guess is as good as mine. These things could have easily been molded into the model, but for one reason or another, ESCI seemed to omit it, which is quite strange, because on the instructions, they actually do have the sections here present, and actually I use these instructions here to map them out. I did verify with some other examples of real Leopard, so it's actually pretty true to form. So to add these sections here, I just simply marked them with a pencil, and then I drilled into the rear deck here with my pin vise with a small Dremel bit. Here's the pin vise here. The bit in question is number 63. As for my bits, I get them from the vendor right over here. This is the same guy I always give a shout out to in my videos for a good reason. Matter of fact, I kind of need to buy some more because I'm kind of running low on my bits. But anyway, this is number 63, and it's a 0.0370 inch bit. Can't help you if you're metrically inclined. I barely know what that is, and I'm imperial inclined. So the only thing I know is that bit's pretty small. Anyway, with the pin vise, I was just able to put a little indentation to each of these sections over here. You don't want to go all the way through. Just a little shallow divot's all you need. Once the paint and the Pentaline accent goes in there, it's really going to make it shine. I also added the other locations right here on the bottom portion for this. I actually used my Revell Germany Leopard 1A5 build. I looked it up on YouTube on the iPad over here, and I was able to map it accordingly with that video. And the way you see it was the way I saw it on the other example. Obviously, this really helps complete and give a more proper appearance to the rear deck, and it didn't really take that much effort, really. Nothing really much to mention on the hull at this time, so let's go ahead and switch over to the turret. So the turret did receive a bit of modifications compared to the way the kit original was. The kit original does go together pretty easily. There was a small little sinkhole in this section over here. Took care of that with a little swipe of red putty, polish it down to the result that we have here. The Entire turret itself, I went ahead and added cast texturing with some texture paint, specifically Tamiya pavement paint. I've referenced that stuff on a few other videos. I have a bottle of it right here. Here you go. This is the stuff that I use. It's an acrylic paint, and I basically just blop it on with a paintbrush. And after a coat or two, once it dries, it leaves for a nice little texture, which is a pretty good replicant for cast texturing, which not only would be found on the vehicle, but in this scale over here, once the layers of paint go on, it will really give the model a little bit of an edge. One reason why I like using this on some applications as opposed to the red putty method is because I have a little bit more control over that because it's applied with a paintbrush, as opposed to the red putty where I'm rolling with my finger. It works on larger areas, but on something 172 like this, where we have some collateral damage potential, it's best to go with the more precise method. Even with a spatula or other type of tools, the paintbrush is still more precise with the application compared to the other methods. The other thing to mention is the gypsy rack here. This is probably the hardest part on the entire turret assembly. The piece on the middle over here did need to have some hand fitting to get it to fit in place, and also needed some polishing. There was a sinkhole right there on the top hatch, plugged up with some red putty and some super glue, and some careful wet sanding was used for that. There was another one, I believe, here on the side that was also addressed and taken care of, as well as on the reverse side. Can't really see it because, one, I did a good job blending it in, but also with the way the gypsy rack and these canisters go here, it does a decent job at plugging it up, but I took care of it for good measure. One other thing to mention is on the bottom portion of the piece, it is hollow, and this does hurt the look of the piece. So what I did was I filled it in with some casting resin. You cannot use just standard red putty for this because red putty is tooling based, and in application of thin coats on plastic models, it works just fine. However, when you have something en masse like this here, it's going to lead to issues. One, it's going to take longer to dry, it's going to crack when there's a sufficient volume of it like this, and the worst part of all, since it's tooling, it could potentially melt or harm the model itself, none of which are beneficial. So what I did was I just went ahead and just used some resin that I had during a casting session, and I went ahead and filled this little area in. Once the resin solidified, I just polished it down with some sandpaper, leaving for the appearance that we have here. And now that the piece is solid, it's much more complete. The racks themselves, kit original, they went on okay. The bottom sections, not so much. They needed some hand fitting in order to get the pieces to fit on the appropriate locations. So this is one of those type of things you have to measure twice and cut once, because if you screw up, you're going to be pretty much screwed. So definitely, this was the one area to watch out for. On the side sections, we have the grab handles that are added. These is an iconic bit of detailing for Leopards that are absent on the ESCI tooling. However, it's on the instructions, so again, go figure. And it's also on the box art. But either way, all Leopards, no matter if it was the pre-production prototype to the later generation ones, all had these little handles in place. And to do this, I had to carefully mark the locations with a pencil on either side, drill out the sections thoroughly with a pin vise, and then I had to fabricate the handles. Handles are fabricated out of thin floor wire that are to scale. And then the hardest part was with the center strut. The Leopard is a lot like the MBT 70, where we have these center sections over here, and the Germans just couldn't leave just a bent wire. Why would they? It's too simple. They can't do that. So I had to go ahead and fabricate the little strut. Strut itself is just some thin pieces of Plastruct strip that were carefully cut to shape and glued to the following locations that we have here, and of course on the reverse side. Once it's all painted and weathered and dry brush, it's definitely going to make the piece shine, and it's going to really elevate the tank, making it look much better than the way we had it originally. On the front section over here, we have the power cable to the searchlight. There is one that's integrally molded in. It's a bit wonky, so I just sanded it away with some sandpaper, drilled a hole where the piece emerged from the turret, and I fabricated a new one out of floor wire. This will be painted a little bit of flap or rubber black after the build, and we'll see what that looks like momentarily. As for the main armament, the piece does have the capability of elevating and depressing, but honestly, the design is so poor, it's really janky, and with the tarpaulin here, it's best just to glue it in a permanent state like I did here, so it is no longer functional, but again, that was for good reason. The way the piece is in the fixed state, it's actually elevated upward, so I kind of like the way it looks like this. I'm not really a fan of having them droop downward, but this is a good average way to represent the build, and for this one here, I'm totally cool with it. One last thing to mention at this time is with the rangefinders that we have here, the Leopard has this really cool little device where it opens it up from a little switch that you flick on the inside, and the detailing is present on the ESCI example. However, the arm just basically goes nowhere and just hovers in space, and on the real one it would be again emerging from the model, or from the vehicle's turret. So basically when you're gluing these in place, you want to carefully bend them and spot glue them to the sides of the turret as it would be on the real vehicle. On one of these pieces here is actually very, very frail. I think it was broken upon removal from the sprue. Very finely molded, very fiddly, so you want to be careful with that. But fortunately, I didn't have any problems with cleaning the piece up and installing it to the appropriate location. And again, once it's all painted weathered, it should do the job quite nicely. The very last thing I want to mention is with the main 105. Single piece molding with the exception of the extender there on the end. The piece did have some seam mold lines that are ran on the surfaces over here, just from where the molds join up. This was polished down with some wet sanding, and at least for the look that we have here, obviously once it's painted, it's going to look nice and smooth. On the muzzle section, the piece was glued in place, and I found it best to deburr once it's already glued onto the model, because with the way the piece is, it's so small that if you're trying to deburr, you're just asking for trouble. It's going to fling off the last part of you, and that's not really something that you want. So on this example over here, I first glued it to the model, wait for the glues to thoroughly set, and then from there, it now is actually much more stronger, and I have much better locations in the area to hold the thing in order to do the polishing, and that was done with a needle file, as well as some little swipe of wet sanding for good measure. Jumping forward a little bit further takes to the point that we have here where the model's been painted, weathered, and it's going through its final course of completion. And one of those factors is to secure on the suspension. As you can see with the tracks in this format, they are much easier to paint, as I was referencing before, where I get full access to go in here and paint the appropriate locations and weather them without any sort of obstructions, be it the suspension or the hull itself. The only drawback of this setup, by the way, is that the tracks are very, very frail and can potentially break. In fact, that did happen during this build throughout the course of painting, and even before I filmed this one over here, the track decided to snap in this section, and the same thing I believe happened on this track band, again, during the course of construction. So this is not exactly a foolproof method, but it's your best chance scenario. To fix it, just a little drop of super glue was all that was added. As soon as it's dry, it'll be hard as a rock, and I can secure it in place. And on that note, you can see what the hull looks like without the suspension fitted. Note the panel line accent did its job into all the appropriate locations. And as I frequently mention in these videos, I scrape off the paint that was built up on the swing arms over here, as well as the section for the sprocket, again, to ensure that the piece can slide into place and be fully seated without any sort of inhibitions. And if there's any sort of obstacles in the way, this could potentially cause problems like we saw before where those pieces did snap. So you want to be careful, and you want to make sure that everything goes by as smooth as possible. One way to do that is to scrape off, just a few moments with an X-Acto, the paint on each of these stems here. You'll also see that the return rollers are not fitted yet. That's going to be done after the track bands are fitted in place, because it's easier to plug them on after the fact as opposed to trying to fit everything during the initial installation. However, your situation or your mileage may vary. Me, I like to go ahead and install the return rollers after the tracks are fit in place. And once they are fit in place, I don't have to worry about breaking these things ever again. And also, the return rollers will add a little extra support to the top sections like they're supposed to. But anyway, enough on that. Let me continue to get this thing finished. With the model fully completed, now you get to appreciate all that hard work that I mentioned in the previous scenes in its final form. After the paint was scraped off of the axles that I showed previously, the pontoons just slid directly into place with a little drop of glue added, and once everything is fully seated, the installation and the hard work of the vehicle is really now completed. If I go ahead and hold the model up, you get to appreciate all that detailing found on the inner portions here. Even though the shock absorber and side hull details are integrally molded into the side plate and are not separate pieces, they are molded to a point where they stand off quite nicely, and as you can see with a little bit of, to me, a panel line accent, really jump out at the viewer, and the pieces are very nicely detailed for being quite simplistic. On the row wheels themselves, I went ahead and did the feature of having the red portion on the hubcap tip sections that painted in red. This is something that is seen on all Leopards and, by extension, Bundeswehr pattern of vehicles. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that this is the point to access the Zerk fitting, which necessitates the place being red for high visibility. Obviously, the application of this paint over here is done with extreme precision. You want to have your paintbrush and your paint game on point because one slight small mishap and it could potentially ruin the look. Another way to apply the paint is if you take a pinhead and you dip it into the paint and you have just enough paint on the surface, you can actually use that as an applicator to apply the paint in the appropriate locations. But again, your technique may vary. Either way, some precision and a steady hand are going to be paramount for this. Not to mention the right paint consistency. While also on the suspension, after the track and the pontoons were fitted in place, I also went ahead and then mounted on the return rollers. The return rollers, as I mentioned before, are separate molded parts, and they get installed after the pontoons are fitted in place. Because the track does not have any sort of guide horn detailing, the piece just slides right on without any sort of issues. For the return rollers themselves, I went ahead and painted these surfaces to look like rubber with Tamiya rubber black, as these would be rubber rimmed on the real vehicle. So that's something you don't want to forget on your Leopard projects. One other thing that's really cool is that because this model is built without the side skirts rendered, or fitted in place I should say, you really get to appreciate all that nice detailing which normally gets concealed by the side skirts on these vehicles. Quickly bouncing back to the Zerk fitting takes us to the one here on the sprocket right there in the center, and also one on the front idler. And this again, something you don't want to forget for good measure. From the row wheels brings us to the track. And as I mentioned before, the ESCI track is actually nicely rendered, well, specifically the face portions at least. And in order to really build this model to its full potential, you really have to be careful with the paint and weathering work on these locations over here. First, they're very, very tiny and frail, and you could potentially break something, or you can have a misswipe with the paint and then cause some further issues. When it comes to paint and weathering these tracks, as I mentioned in another Leopard 1 video, you're going to be following the same rules as you do on the American tanks, like the M48, M60, M47, M46, and even the Pershing, because, as I also mentioned in that other video, the Leopard 1 is literally just a Germanified Patton or Pershing, and I know that pisses people off, but I don't care. Back to the Leopard track over here. So what this means is that the track is a mix between rubber and metal components, and you have to carefully paint and weather these separately or independently in order to get the appropriate look. So on the model over here, because of the tight confines, I went ahead and paint them in the following format. First, I didn't want to make them rusty like I did on the other Leopard. This one here, I wanted to replicate a vehicle that was still more, let's just say, newer in its service compared to the other counterpart. So what I did was, of course, first the entire track was painted with the flat black spray paint as a primer. Then what I went ahead and did was, after the wheels were painted with a paintbrush, because you can't use an airbrush for these, it's way too tightly confined, so a paintbrush was used to paint these, and specifically the sprocket here, which is probably the hardest part, because you got to get into the recesses. But either way, after the paint work was done, I went ahead and applied a wash of flat white via the airbrush on all the surfaces. And after the flat white was set, I then went ahead and dry brushed some silver onto the end portions here of the track. These, of course, would be metal on the real unit, so they would get scratched as the vehicle is driving. What I went ahead and did was, after the flat white and the dry brushing was done, I then took Tamiya rubber black, and with the paintbrush, I carefully painted all the little rubber blocks on the face section. Once the Tamiya paint set, you can see a clear difference between the two materials, and you can see a difference between what's metal and what would be rubber. If I go ahead and put the model on its side over here, hopefully it comes out in better light. On some of the larger scale builds, I've accomplished a similar effect while using Tamiya NATO black for the metal areas, and then have a different type of black or a flat black or rubber black for the rubber sections to get a similar effect. However, I was able to accomplish essentially the exact same look, but with the use of just diluted flat white. And while on the topic of the tracks, brings us to, again, the final assembly of these tracks. As I mentioned before, the hardest aspect on this model are indeed the assembly of the individual Lincoln Lane tracks. And on this model over here, what you see here is really the best you're going to get with the kit supplied parts. And I'm actually quite more than satisfied on the end result. Even with that mishap that I had before, I was still able to go ahead and make everything blend in nearly perfectly. And as I mentioned before, if you are absolutely stuck and shoehorned for one reason or another in having to use the individual Lincoln Lane tracks, the way I show in these videos is really your best bet and your best case scenario in order to pull it off and do it in a way that doesn't have the end result of it looking like crap. From the suspension brings to the rear hull detailing. I already mentioned this in depth earlier in the video, but here again you can see what it looks like in its final format. The hardest part on this area in paintwork is in painting all the tiny little lenses here on the tail lights. Leopard ones have a lot of lights going on back there, and you have to carefully paint them in order to achieve the proper result. So the way you see here is the correct format, where we have a mix of red and orange, and hopefully it comes out on camera on which colors go where. This again, you need to be on point with your paintbrush game as well as also with your paint consistency. Also skipping ahead to markings, you get to see all the decals fitted in place. However, two of the decals I had to make some modifications to. First is the Italian flag right over here. The flag is literally right on top of the spare track guide horns that are located in these two sections. Obviously, it's a bit problematic with putting the decal in place. So what I did was I went ahead and had to physically cut the decal. First I cut it in half and I removed a section of the middle of the white portion so that I could go ahead and add the two areas on either side, and where the teeth are would be white underneath on top of the white area on the real vehicle. By doing this, I'm able to achieve the desired look without having any other type of complications. One other area though that was just ridiculously crazy trying to apply the decals to was the little cruciform convoy light. In true German format, there would be these four little stripes in this section over here, and these are actually kit supplied as decals, which is a stress test at best. These decals are ridiculously tiny on 135. On 172, they are nano in scale, and trying to get in there with a point of a toothpick and line up four of them is a bit of a problem. So much so that honestly I didn't even try it, and I just went to the try-true method and just painted them with a paintbrush. Some flat white, thin paintbrush, right consistency, and I went ahead and applied them to the appropriate locations, leaving for the proper end result. Also, one last thing I want to mention on this area over here is to paint the molded in spare track link as well as the guide horns. These are something that can easily be overlooked, but again, if you carefully paint them with the same or similar painting techniques that were mentioned before, you will have some good results. And once everything is painted, it really just stands out from the rest of the paintwork on the rear. And one last thing I do want to mention is with the mud flaps. The Leopard one has these rubber mud flaps found on the rear portion, and you just want to go ahead and paint them to resemble rubber. So to me, rubber black was applied with a paintbrush, a little bit of airbrushing of flat white later gets it the worn chalky look that we have here, and this was done to both the exterior and interior portions. That's another thing that generally a lot of people miss. Whenever they're painting something like this, they paint the outside, which is great, but they forget to paint the reverse portion, which of course would be visible on this example here. Same is also true for not just the back, but also with the front tin work, as we can see right here. Two rubber mud flaps, again, a shot of Tamiya rubber black with a shot of flat white via the airbrush to get the weathering. On the sections though, you want to make sure you paint what's rubber and what would be metal, and there would be a metal strap here that anchors and secures the rubber in place. Also on the front, you get to see the track grouser sections found on the front plate, an iconic bit of detailing for the Leopard, specifically Leopard 1. And for this, it's required careful paint work to get in here and make sure everything is properly painted. And then for weathering, just a little bit of dry brushing was done with a little bit of silver paint in order to get the look that you see here. Also, what carefully needs to be painted are, again, the headlights. Just like with the taillights on the front portion of the Leo, there's quite a bit of lights going on. So we have the two headlights right here and here. There is a blackout light right there and there, and you can see I actually add a little sliver here of silver paint to get those painted. And we have little fender indicator lights right here on either side, which would be orange. And again, very finely molded, but a tiny little swipe of orange paint will definitely do the job. On the reverse side, we do have the side view mirrors. Again, a very German Bundeswehr thing, even though it's an Italian vehicle. It still has the Bundeswehr little touches on it. And for this, a little swipe of silver paint on the inside for the lens of the mirror. And then I went ahead and just used the Tamiya rubber black to paint the rubber portions here that would be found on the side areas. The back would be same color of the vehicle, so you don't want to make that mistake and paint those sections with the black material, or the black color, I should say. And one last thing to mention on the front is the driver's hatch. The periscopes were painted with gloss black, as I commonly reference in these videos. The painting of the periscopes on a small 172 like this is very crucial because it gives you the nice detailing, which is kit supplied. But again, the risk is quite great. If your paintbrush game is not on point, you can easily screw this up. But if you navigate the waters correctly, the juice is most certainly, again, worth the squeeze. And this is definitely a recurring theme on this build, if you haven't noticed, with the tools. Again, paintwork is paramount. You want to make sure the handle is properly painted, the shovel heads or the tool heads are properly painted, and don't forget to paint the straps and the tool post. Common thing, commonly overlooked. And as you can see, once you go ahead and do that, it really makes the model, again, kick well above its weight. On the reverse side, same thing applies. And you will have some nice end results if you, again, pull it off. Moving topside takes us to the engine deck. One aspect on the Leo 1 that's a iconic bit of detailing are the exhaust manifolds, found these really large grill sections that we have here on the sides. This little airbrushing here of Tamiya flat black was utilized in order to get the end results that we see here. Again, very nice little bit of detailing, a little poof there of the flat black really does quite a bit. On the top engine deck over here, you get to see how that panel line accent goes into all these really nice little areas over here and really makes this thing, again, built to its full potential. The grill work absolutely loves it, specifically these two guys over here, and then not to mention the panel lines and those little holes for the fasteners that I added earlier. The panel line accent truly is your best friend in this regard. For the fuel cap, I went ahead and added a little bit of gloss right there to emulate the little spillage, which again, quite commonly seen on heavy equipment and by extension military vehicles as well. Naturally, this brings us to the turret, and here you get to see, hopefully in this lighting here, the cast texturing that was applied before, how it gives the turret a bit of extra depth and dimension, as opposed to leaving the thing completely smooth. You also get to see those handles that I mentioned before, and this really is, in my opinion, a must-have bit of detailing for the turret, as whenever I think Leo 1s, these grab handles always come to my attention and stick with me in my memory. So it's one of those things where if you definitely add those details, it will really, really spice up the build and, again, make it polish that much more. Of course, on the smoke grenade launchers, they have the end portions that are made in rubber, so a little swipe, again, rubber black was added to all these areas to finish the look. And on the back portion here, you get to see the added antenna bases. These, I believe, are just a little piece of wire that was drilled into the model, or holes were drilled in the model, a little piece of wire was added. On the real units, they resemble the American MP65 antenna base, only instead of being that amber red color like they are on the American units, on the German pattern units, they are a bronze violet or a German olive type color. Best way to put it, an olive. Best way to describe it. However, in order to achieve this look here, I just went ahead and utilized just, I believe, standard American olive drab. A little drop on the bottom portion, which is integrally molded on, gives you the look of the antenna base itself. Then a little bit of rubber black was used to simulate the top portions, which again would be rubber on the real 65s. Of course, here we have the gypsy rack. I mentioned that before, and you can see what it looks like in its final format. Also, if I flip the model over, you can see how much better it looks that the bottom portion was filled in. Definitely goes a long way. The hardest aspect on the turret was indeed painting the little periscopes. Because the German cupola has the periscopes really sunk in, trying to get in there with a paintbrush is a little tricky. In fact, it's almost like the final boss when it comes for painting. But as you can see, I was able to navigate the waters just fine and able to get the paint where they needed to go. It's one of those little details you'll definitely notice when you look at one of these things up close. This, of course, brings us to the Maschine Gewehr 3, the infamous MG3. This is the kit supply one, and again, just basic paintwork was all that was needed to polish it up. When it comes to painting one of these, you want to know what part is MG3 and what part is Leopard, and you can see here the mount was painted with the same color as the rest of the vehicle. And on the MG3 itself, again, you want to make sure you know what materials were using, what colors to paint them. So unlike the MG42, where the stocks were either Bakelite and or wood, on the MG3 that wasn't the case. The material switched to a black polymer type material and kept in that manner all the way up until really the present day. So for an MG3, if you're painting one, you want to utilize a gloss black material to replicate this. I use Tamiya Gloss Black. It's a fantastic color for this, and once you apply it on with a paintbrush, it really gets you the appropriate look that you desire. For the remainder of the weathering work, this was just done in my usual format with the use of some dry brushing for the distressed look, and then of course once that's done, the gloss black was applied to the stock section, giving you for the look that you see here. One other thing to mention about the paint work on the turret is with the optic right over here. Don't want to forget to paint that little guy. Also add a little bit of sheen there for the lens for good measure. I believe I drilled this out with a pin vise in order to get the optic section, if I'm not mistaken. A little hazy. It's been a while since I built it, believe it or not, when I'm filming this, but it's definitely something that if it is flat, the little indent there will definitely improve the model that much more. Moving to the front takes to the power cable for the searchlight. Like I mentioned before, it's a piece of metal floor wire that I added in place, and now that's painted and weathered, it looks fantastic. Really is a huge improvement over the molded in one. And that takes us to the tarpaulin. Tarpaulin looks great. Actually, like I mentioned before, it's one of the better pieces on the kit. Nicely rendered out. I just went ahead and painted it and weathered it to the format you see here. The paintwork, I believe, is Model Master Green Drab. And I believe also it's the color I used for the two guys over here, if memory serves. So this was applied with a paintbrush. Then I went in there and weathered it with some washes and other sort of agents to get the look that you see here of that canvas, that rubbery canvas material. And I think it really came out quite nicely. Moving to the mantlet, one little bit of detailing that's very, very subtle that this kit does have that most people probably would overlook would be the little plugs that we have over the two sections here on the mantlet for the bow coax MG and also the gunner's optic. If you look at the preserved Leopard 1 that's in the Bovington Tank Museum, you will see that there are these two little rubber plugs in these sections over here, and these are integrally molded into the kit. So rather than trying to amputate them and drill them out, I just simply left them with the molded in ones, and to improve it, I just took a little swipe of Tamiya Rubber Black and added to both of these locations. And as you can see, it gives a nice unique look to the model that doesn't require any sort of extra upgrades. Moving to the 105, nothing much talking about over here. Just, again, Tamiya panel line accent is definitely going to be your best buddy. And that's all there is to mention about the details. This takes to the paint and the markings. So for the model's paintwork, before I could go ahead and do any sort of paintwork whatsoever, the surface needs to be primed. I always mention this in these videos because no matter what paint you're using, being from Tamiya or Vallejo or Mission, they always seem to stick better and adhere better to the surface if you have some kind of primer present. You could use some kind of fancy modeling primer that will work just fine, or you could do what I do and just use some standard El Cheapo flat black spray paint. Either way will get you some good results. From there, it was then time to apply the base coat. For the color, I went with my traditional route with using exterior latex house paint, which again is something that seems to be a point of contention for some individuals out there. However, the builds speak for themselves. I'm very happy with the quality of it, and I'm going to continue to use this paint in perpetuity until the end of time, and you can just deal with it. So, another reason why I went with this method is because the hue that I was looking for is not exactly one that is a common off-the-shelf color found by the other manufacturers, so I wanted to go ahead and replicate that. And when it comes to this pattern of vehicle being a NATO Leopard 1 from the 1960s, 1970s time frame, there was a certain color that these vehicles had, be it from the Bundeswehr to the Italian Army to the Dutch to even the French. They had a certain color to them, and I wanted to closely emulate that. And this wasn't exactly an off-the-shelf color. So what I did was I found some pictures online of a real Leopard 1, an Italian one specifically, and I went ahead and cobbled a color swatch together, along with a color swatch of a few other colors, namely something, say, like Gelb Olive or Natto Olive Mat. I have a few colors that are similar to this, but are slightly different. And I went ahead and went to the Home Depot, had that mix in a little sample format, and from there I was able to apply it to the model. Of course, the paint cannot be applied to the surface directly. It's far too thick, and you need to dilute it. Of course, I just use standard tap water, and I get to the right consistency, and from there it applies to the surface without any sort of problems. Specifically, when you have primer on the model surface, as I referenced before. After the color was added, I then went ahead and started the weathering. For the weathering, I utilized both the airbrush and some dry brushing, as I generally mentioned. For the airbrushing, it starts with a little bit of sun fading effects with a diluted cream color, which again is an exterior latex color that I cobbled together. And for the application, I get done via the airbrush. Once the sun fading effects were applied to the appropriate locations, I then went ahead and did some counter shading with the use of diluted Tamiya flat black. Again, a bit different compared to some people out there where they do that before the base coat, and I can't stand that technique. As I always reference, I will never do that technique. It's just an awful one. But some people love it, I hate it, and I don't do that on my build. My build, I go ahead and apply it after the base coat is added. Anyway, so the diluted flat black is applied via the airbrush again to the areas that I want the counter shading on, and then from there it's time for the Tamiya panel line accent. The panel line accent, as we saw before, goes into all of the little areas over here, and it really makes the model just really bring it up to its full potential. I love that stuff. I cannot recommend it enough. After the panel line accent was done, did a little bit of dry brushing with a little bit of flat black, done with the fan brush, and that's how you get the little chipping effects that you see on the surfaces on these builds. Once that was done, it was then time to add the decals. And as I referenced before, the decals on these older ESCI kits are sometimes hit and miss. Sometimes they Thanos snap out of existence. Other times they go on without any sort of problems, as if they're brand new printed decals. And on this one here, I'm happy to say that that was definitely the latter. The decals went on without any sort of problems, with the exception of the Italian flag in the back that I mentioned before. But other than that, no problems whatsoever. I was pleasantly and happily surprised. And by now I've done a number of these ESCIs, and it seems like the decals that I was able to use, as opposed to ones that I wasn't able to use, have been averaging out to usable. So if you get an older ESCI kit, chances are really good the decals more or less will be okay for your build. So I'm just going to go ahead on record and say that. After the decals were applied, I then went ahead and thoroughly coated the model with the VMS matte varnish. Again, I swear by that stuff. It is the best varnish on the market that I've personally seen. It goes on extremely easily. There's no prep work required. It just does exactly what it mentions on the tin, and in this day and age, that's really all you can ask for. It's applied via the airbrush. You just spray it on after the decals are fitted in place, and once the stuff sets, it does a fantastic job. The decals look great. There's no sheen or silvering or anything along those lines. It's really your best case scenario for decals on any plastic model. I live and swear by that stuff. In addition to making the decals look like they're flat on the surface, it does a really interesting look to the model where it just gives it a little bit of a glow. It just gives it just a little polished look to it. It's one of those things where if you see it, it just looks that much better. It amplifies it. It really does. Of course, when you're doing that, you don't have any glossy bits yet. So no headlights, no shiny silver parts on the MG. In fact, the MGs aren't even varnished. I do it at the very tail end. But that's one thing to keep in mind when you're working on a model and using the VMS. As you can see, throughout the duration of this video, the ESCI Leopard 1 kit is actually very nicely done, despite the age of its tooling. In many areas, the kit really did age quite nicely. And although I could say this several times, in order to get a good grasp on exactly how well this kit aged, you really need to compare and contrast it with a modern tooling counterpart. Well, fortunately, I am in the situation where I have just that. A number of videos ago, I went ahead and did another Leopard 1, but from a more modern tooling kit, and I have it right here. This here, straight out of the collection, is my other 1/72nd scale Leopard 1. Only this one here is a Leopard 1 A5, and this one here is from the company Revell, Germany. As I mentioned in this video here, this is a phenomenal kit and really does pack quite a punch in terms of detailing and detail fidelity, as well as the quality of the moldings. And now that I have the two side by side, you really get to see exactly just how nicely rendered out the older tooling kit is compared to its modern brother. In many ways, I would argue that the Revell Germany kit really is the spiritual successor to the older ESCI kit here of the 80s. In several aspects, the two are very similar. As you can see, the scale-wise is practically identical to one another, and the Revell Germany kit basically picked up where the ESCI kit left off. Where on the ESCI kit, the suspension was very simplistic. On the Revell kit, they went ahead and improved it quite a bit, giving you some much better molding and details. Also, needless to say, the Revell Germany kit represents a more modern version and improved version of the Leopard 1, being the Leopard 1 A5. However, there's some aspects of this kit here that does have the ability to potentially backdate it to an earlier rendition, much along the lines like we have on this one here, but that's a topic for another video. Either way, compared to the two builds, the two models will hold up very well and do complement each other extremely nicely if you have them both in your collection. However, this is something I'm going to circle back to in the next scene. However, before I get too ahead of myself, one last thing I do want to mention is that, oddly enough, this one here is still more readily available and a little bit more affordable when found compared to the more modern tooling counterpart. So take that for what you will. In the end, I really couldn't be any happier in how this build turned out. This was actually a rather pleasant build from start to finish, with the exception of the mishap with the track that I mentioned before, but outside of that, the remainder of the build went by pretty much effortlessly, and I had a very enjoyable time throughout the entire build duration. The build really did exceed my expectations on what the thing was going to look like in the end result. Over the years, I must say, I've grown a bit of an affection towards these old-school ESCI 1/72nd scale kits. I've had some very pleasant experiences with working with them, and this one here was definitely no exception. As the time goes on, I'm not going to be surprised if I eventually end up with the entire ESCI lineup in the collection, but again, that remains to be seen, and it's definitely a future video for another day. As we saw during this video, this model here really did age quite nicely, and despite the age of the tooling, it really does hold up quite well considering the options that we currently have on the market. And that is a perfect and convenient point to pivot us into skill level and recommendation. So, from the beginning, is this a model that I could recommend to a beginner, i.e. someone that's either never touched a build before, or they've done maybe 2 or 3 easy builds? And if that's you, the answer is absolutely, most certainly, no. Don't think about it. Not for you. Just keep on walking. This is not something that you're going to be having a really pleasant experience with building. And this is done because of a few factors. First, the scale. The model is very small, and because of that, the parts are even tinier, and this adds complexity to a build. Number 2, the individual link and link tracks. These are tricky for some advanced builders or even intermediate builders, but a beginner has absolutely no business with even attempting one with the very simple skill sets that they do have. And then the third is because of the age of the tooling, there are some components that do need a little bit of hand fitting here and there in order to get the parts to properly fit. And again, this is something that a beginner really doesn't have the skill sets with and being ready to tackle. This model here, I would recommend for someone really who's an intermediate to an advanced range builder. An intermediate builder should have these skill sets that I just mentioned more or less figured out, and by that point there, they should have the prerequisites capable of putting one of these together and having a decent go at it. An advanced range builder should also definitely be able to have the skill sets to build one of these. However, the advanced builder may potentially find one of these kits to be a bit primitive to their liking. And chances are really good if there's certain vintage, they probably already built 1 or 2 of these kits already in the past. The model itself, although it did age quite nicely, it kind of straddles the fence between a model that is simplistic in overall external detail fidelity, but is one that still polishes up extremely well. And because of that, a advanced builder may still be able to find this kit quite enjoyable. Again, it does have some lacking in certain areas I mentioned in this video, but if you're a advanced range person, you could definitely be able to either work within the confines of the kit to really bring it out to its full potential, or potentially go outside the kit and cobble something together, either scratch build or potentially find something in the aftermarket scene. As for the aftermarket scene, I'm not really sure if there's really anything out there. This kit here, it's not exactly as common or as popular as some of the other builds I've brought to this channel in the past, so I'm not really sure if there's really much aftermarket support that's out there. However, these days, with the proliferation of 3D printers, I'm pretty sure a lot of people might have the skill sets to take this thing and basically run with it from what the base starter kit does give you. As I mentioned before, I had an absolute blast while working on this one here, and the kit does build into a very decent representation of the Leopard 1A2. Even as we saw it before, comparing and contrasting it to the Revell Germany Leopard 1A5, this one here, despite its age, still holds up quite well pound for pound with the modern equivalent. Which is why I suppose, after all these years, this thing is still with us today in one way, shape, or form or another. The kit does have quite a bit of potential to it being what it is. The Leopard 1 was widely exported to a lot of NATO countries, as well as also being used by the Bundeswehr itself. And if you're capable of tracking down some different type of markings, you could easily go ahead and build this vehicle in a multitude of different configurations. As we saw before, the kit does have the ability to be built with or without the side skirts, which again is a way to add more flexibility and adaptability to the build, which again can lead to some more interesting type variations that you can build and render with the base starter kit. It's definitely something to keep as food for thought. However, nothing much more to say about that. This brings us directly into recommendations. So, from the beginning, if you are a fan of Cold War era tanks, this kit here is definitely recommended. If you're a fan of the Leopard family and you dig the vehicles from the Bundeswehr, again, this is also definitely a kit to keep on your radar and check out. Even though the stock kit does not give you the decals for the Bundeswehr, it's definitely Bundeswehr adjacent, being the vehicle pattern that it is. And by extension, if you're just into collecting German tanks, specifically the big cats, you can't have the German zoo complete without a Leopard. Even though, yes, the Leopard has nothing in common with the World War II German tanks, but that's besides the point. It's still a nice little vehicle to have in the collection regardless. Another person who I would recommend this kit to is anyone who's into building and collecting Braille scale. This was an excellent build, and it's definitely one that would greatly enhance your collection tenfold. And along similar lines, one other individual who I would not necessarily recommend this kit to would be anyone who's into wargaming. And this may be a surprise because on face value, this model here would be actually fantastic for it. The 1/72nd scale hobby is actually closely linked to wargamers. A lot of guys like to utilize kits in this scale to flesh out their collection and use them for their wargaming needs. However, this kit, again, on face value would be great for that, but the problem comes with the availability. These kits are vintage kits, and they're not really nearly as prolific or as affordable as they used to be when these things were still in production several years ago. And because of that, what's on the market's on the market, so trying to track one down, although it's relatively easily done, when it comes to wargaming, they tend to need a large number of them, something about in the realm of 10 to 20 or so, and that's where the availability will become an issue. Even though Italain does have the molds for this kit here and have re-released it in the past, the problem is that they haven't re-released it since the mid-2000s. And in its own right, the Italain version is becoming just as collectible as the ESCI one. Hopefully, at some point, this is subject to change. Again, they do have the mold, so at any time, Italain, you're watching this, they want to release this kit, they literally can, and when that happens, they can open up the floodgates, and you can have tons of these things at your disposal. But until then, you might want to put a pin in it if you're a wargamer. Again, it's sad because on face value, it would be awesome for that, but sadly, the logistics just aren't there at this time. Finally, I would recommend this kit to anyone who's an avid fan of building and collecting vintage model kits. Well, basically like yours truly. And if that's you, then this kit here will have all of the attributes stacked in its favor. I'm talking about the kit's background, the vintage, the availability, the cost, and the enjoyment of construction. All of those are, again, stacked in this thing's favor and stacked very highly. And because tracking down one of these kits is relatively easy and also relatively affordable when found, this again makes the enjoyment of collecting and fleshing out the collection all that much more enjoyable. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for my 1/72nd scale Italian Army Leopard 1 A2 main battle tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or my other type of content being large scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Ciao.